Well, Dr. Stephen Jensen, I'd like to thank you very much for agreeing to be interviewed in our disaster interview series. Welcome.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to be able to share some of my experience with your students.
I wonder if you could take a couple minutes to begin with, just to tell us about your background and how you ended up in this field.
Okay. I guess I'm one of the old guys in the field. 42 years being in this work. I started out in humanitarian assistance, then evolved into the fire service. And eventually found myself in the middle of quite a few disasters in Southern California and developed this specialty that really wove together humanitarian assistance and fire, but it was an emergent field of emergency management. So I'm fortunate I got to be able to grow up with it. I'll tell you a little bit more detail about it, if that's okay.
Sure, yeah.
Okay. The humanitarian assistance started back in 1979. I was very compelled, wanted to go work in the on the Thai-Cambodia border. Pol Pot had just fallen when the Vietnamese invaded the country. Cambodia, then a country of about 6 million people, 2 million of them killed off in a genocide there, the rest of them fleeing some horrific situations. And I felt compelled to go and work in that situation. Nobody was really interested in hiring a university dropout to go and do that. I was 20 at the time. And just bought a plane ticket and went down there. Flew into Bangkok, met some people along the way. One thing led to another, and 2 days later, I was on the Thai-Cambodia border working in a refugee camp. So the camp was 2 days old. It quickly grew to 130,000 people. A few of us volunteers stayed on as staff to help build this thing and provide a bit more stability. Again, I was young. I had no idea what I was doing. There was a guy by the name of Fred Cuny, who was sort of famous in the field back in the day. And he was advising us along the way about how you handle these kind of situations. Other than that, the oldest guy working in the camp was 25, a guy named Mark Moloch Brown, who eventually became quite well known in the field and went on to direct some UN agencies and worked on the Millennium Development Goals back in the day and all that. So people learned a whole lot in this situation. But other than Fred's guidance, we really had to just figure it out along the way. And you go home at night after working a hard day and just think, oh my gosh, there's 130,000 people depending on me, and I don't have a clue what's going on, and that's it.
So can I ask you what the main lessons at that time that were that you learned?
The main lessons, first was a whole lot of humility and just keep asking questions, seeking guidance and all that, being patient, being diligent. Working with the refugee population themselves was really important. One of the people I worked very closely with had been a operations manager for the national airline before Cambodia fell in 75. And he knew how to get things done. Others had a bit more administrative experience. I could ask them, but the main point was we had no guidance. There was very little structure to what this field looked like. We're so fortunate right now to have so many different, very high quality programs. One at the top being what you're doing at York, that prepare people. They understand disasters, humanitarian assistance. They understand what people are going through and how we manage these things. And we're so much better prepared. We have systems in place that didn't exist back then, both at the UN level and bilateral type of systems, national, local systems. So it's a completely different thing, a much more complex situation. But then we're dealing with problems that are more widespread. In the humanitarian world, 65 million refugees right now, the unheard of, scale that we're dealing with in the world population. So we'd best be up to speed. But I guess that's the main thing is, we had to figure it out along the way, and just with humility and, asking questions when we could and thinking things through together, it really made a difference. Fred Cooney was a lifesaver at that point. You know, he had some experience. He understood the basics of the incident command system, which he helped us put in place within the refugee camp. We had no idea what it was when we developed operations, logistics, planning, and we had an administrative level. But in his wisdom, he showed us a way.
It's great that you had him there. I'm not sure if you're going to want to answer this question, but when you look back in those early years, do you have one regret that stands out to you, or when you think back, one mistake that you made that you just really wish you could go back and change?
Well, I get that there's two ways of answering that. There's always these things in life. What if I had turned left instead of right? You know, what would have been my trajectory in life? So had I stayed with humanitarian assistance, would have been a different kind of thing, I suppose. But we wanted to come back. I worked in Cambodia and then worked in Malaysia, again, this time for Vietnamese boat people. After that, we wanted to be a little bit more settled in the US and have a little bit more stable life to start a family. So had we turned left instead of right, maybe we would have carried on with this thing and, died in a slaughter or found ourselves in, a much different kind of a life. But, no regrets, where I've been able to go is fantastic. In a little bit less obtuse answer, one of my big regrets was making a big mistake in logistics one day, trying to take care of refugees. It was sort of a complex thing. I made a call which didn't turn out quite correctly. And 25,000 very hungry people went to bed even hungrier that night. So I didn't really enjoy my dinner that night, but
Oh, I can imagine.
yeah, we did our best, but that was the thing. I finished up working in Cambodia, finished my bachelor's degree, and then went back to work with the UN a second time with the High Commissioner for Refugees, and that time went to Malaysia and worked on a small island called Pulau Bidong, which became the home for, at that time, about 10,000 Vietnamese boat people. And it was 2 years living and working on that island, which was, an incredible experience, and with a lot of challenges yet again, but the scales were quite different. It was the interesting thing between it. By then I had my bachelor's degree, and I knew a little bit more about international affairs and a little bit more about sociology, just a little bit. And I came in with more arrogance about that than I should have. I didn't ask as many questions. And I think my effectiveness suffered because of it. And the bottom line in these situations is now after 42 years, I see there's just so much more to learn each day. And there's so many people depending on us to do this work correctly. If we're not asking questions every day, we're really making a big mistake.
Yeah.
And there's an ethics that goes along with that too, of not assuming we know more than we do. So
in those 4 decades, how is your sense of how disasters themselves have changed? Is the problem similar to what it was 40 years ago? Has the problem changed? Certainly our profession has changed, and all of us do try and look forward. How is the disaster problem going to change in the future? How does our profession have to evolve to continue to address it? What are your thoughts along those lines?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, there's a lot of dimensions to that question. I'll fast forward a little bit in my own story. So I came back to the United States, ended up working in the fire service in the Los Angeles area. And over the years, I've done about 22 years working in the fire service. Within that, I developed a specialty in emergency management, which was, again, just emerging as a field. We really, around LA, we cut our teeth on, first on the riots after the Rodney King beatings. The And that was a watershed event for us too. We never thought that we would see this kind of thing happening in our hometown, but it did. That was followed by the Northridge earthquake, which was a big event for us here in LA. Followed again, well, actually before that, with the some wildfires in 1993 across Malibu. How these things have changed the events themselves is maybe first of all the unpredictability. We should have seen the riots coming. They'd had riots, back in 1964 in Watts in Los Angeles, but we didn't see them coming at the scale. We didn't see how organized this whole thing was and how it could spread very quickly. And we were caught out. Fortunately, we had systems that were pretty good that were in place that allowed us to cope quickly. One was we had an incident command system that was reasonably well developed because of the wildfire problem in California. We had mutual aid systems that allowed us to adapt very quickly. And we had the national support, which was excellent. We were able to get SWAT teams, which were a fairly new thing back in the 90s. They were able to come in from around the country to provide safe perimeters for fighting fire and for continuing on with the medical aids are a big part of our work. We had never thought that we would be fighting fire with bulletproof vests on and surrounded by SWAT teams that looked like this RoboCop thing. But we adapted pretty quickly, and the incident command system was good at trying to understand how to manage this situation as it evolved. It failed to anticipate it correctly, but once we kicked into gear, it was unforeseen event, but managed reasonably well. I draw the parallel between that and COVID and our response to COVID. Very present thing over the last year, 18 months. And in my view, our response has been shockingly bad. We failed to anticipate this thing. We had decimated a lot of the systems that were in place to give us early detection. We didn't have the correct relationships with UN agencies or bilateral with China to be able to work together, to be able to nip this thing in the bud before it went too quickly. We were very slow in responding, and we still are slow in communicating to the public what's going on and how we're going to be managing this thing. Now, in some ways, I think our capability is a lot less than it was back then.
On the academic side, over the years, there have been a lot of papers published about pandemics and if there was another global pandemic, what the impact would be like. A lot of these scenarios have been played out. And some of them are part and parcel of national level risk assessments.
Yes.
Where they said, okay, here's the pandemic impact. And I recall the one from the UK, which had that is the highest risk by far, like probably by 2 orders of magnitude. So the knowledge was certainly out there, and yet there is some kind of disconnect that's happening. What are your thoughts on that? The disconnect?
I think the important thing is at every single level, from the highest level in government or our multilateral agencies, all the way down to people in the communities, every single level, we need to take seriously what it's going to be like to live on this planet in the 21st century. And we need to start making adjustments around risk and understanding that this is just a part of our life. And we've done this before. We've, at various levels, we've made our automobiles much safer than they ever had been in the past. They're better engineered. We have seat belts. We control traffic better than we have. And it's required in the federal level, legislation and changes in the manufacturing of vehicles and the engineering. But really it's caused individual behavior to have to change to realize that the seatbelt is an important thing. And we just take all this for granted now. We hop in the car, we put on the seatbelt, and we go and do what we need to do. I look forward to the day in our field in emergency management where it becomes at all levels in the system second nature to think about the risks that are around us, to put in places to manage them, and then just to get on in our lives and do the good things that we're meant here to be doing here. And in the case of pandemic and the potential for much worse ones in the future, it means everything from having the surveillance systems in place and the ability to have early detection when these things pop up, to be able to do the measures that are necessary where these things pop up, to be able to isolate, to be able to quarantine. The vaccine development has been phenomenal. What's happened in Europe and here has been amazing how well the science has been applied and a very safe vaccine developed in a very short period of time. And that kind of technology is going to be easier to use in the future. But it's the soft systems that are the important thing, that we understand how to manage all those systems and to be able to do it in a timely way. And it also, I think, down at the community level requires a certain confidence in those systems and appreciation for just how far we've been able to go with that. Pandemic is a very interesting example because the consequences are so high, but we're also likely to see something like this again within the next decade or two. So yeah, we better start taking it seriously and understanding this is just a part of the life we're going to be living, maybe for a long time.
I think if we're going to become much more effective in terms of these soft systems, we're going to have to work towards depoliticizing disasters as much as possible. And it varies a lot by country, for sure. But the politicization of COVID and some other disasters as well has been a serious barrier in my mind to good management. Do you think it's even possible to kind of turn down the temperature level in that politically and address it in a more professional manner?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We see it in different communities where it's absolutely possible. So the United States right now is ridiculously polarized, and it's just to an unhealthy degree. But we fail to recognize there are many things that just are reality, and we have a common interest in being able to deal with it, and we should be dealing with that and just moving on. Climate change would be a prime example. We don't have to get into long debates about the origins of it. I mean, there's clearly human causes to it, as well as some natural cycles, and the percentage of which contributes is always up for debate. The recent IPCC report that came out early August this year, 2021, comes down pretty hard on an overwhelming amount of human contribution to it. But it's going to take people time to maybe absorb that. But nevertheless, there's certain things that we can do both in mitigation and adaptation. In the climate world, mitigation being, let's just reduce our carbon output or how much we dump into the atmosphere. Whether a person believes in human-caused climate change or not, that's probably a good idea. If we want to get serious at the local level, we're going to be having to adapt to all the impacts that are already coming our way. In Southern California, where we live, sea level rise is going to be a big deal. And that's right across the street for us. We're going to have water in our kitchen by 2050, if even the more conservative estimates are correct. So some adaptation measures are going to be necessary. Otherwise, I guess we're going to be wearing waders when we make our breakfast. But it's also playing out in the interface fire problem around California right now. We're already seeing an environment that's hotter, drier, windier. We're seeing more damage to the trees through bark beetle because of these drier conditions. So we're our forests are in bad health. Our chaparral is overgrown in bad health. We've had poor forest management, poor fire management for many years, and it's created an absolutely horrendous situation. Combined with the changing climate and are living further and further into the interface, it's a terrible situation. And whether a person comes at it from a very conservative view or a more liberal view, it's still a thing that we have to deal with. And how we do that, how we find the common interest between the individual and our communities is very much a present problem here in California. And we're finding it because we have to. It's a very pragmatic approach that we have to take in dealing with this thing. At some point, when a town is severely threatened, we forget about our ideological differences and try to find a pragmatic way to deal with something. So, maybe all these things might be something of an equalizer politically over time.
Do you think the emergency managers of the future are going to need a different kind of education or training than what we've had up to this point?
Yeah, absolutely. We've done a very interesting project down here on this side of the border, looking at the next generation core competencies for emergency managers. So we started this in about 2015 and had a small grant from our Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. And we are charged with having a look at what is the emergency manager of the future? How are we going to educate these people to be more effective with the kinds of risks that are likely to emerge, but also to understand how governance is changing, how communities are changing and all that. So how do we position ourselves to be better at what we do? And it was a very interesting exercise. We put together first a white paper, sort of a straw man argument about what that might look like. We got some of the best thinkers on this subject together outside of Washington, DC to think about it for a while and tear apart that white paper and see if we can figure out a better way to look at this. We refined that with input and identified what we thought might be core competencies that could drive the education systems in our field. Core competencies being the things that really distinguish us as a profession, the things that allow us to do the work particularly well. And it was a fairly new concept in organizational theory coming out of Harvard in the 90s. Some work had been done in 2005 by Wayne Blanchard with FEMA and having an early set of core competencies. We thought 10 years later, it was time to revisit them and see if we can clean them up a little bit better. So we took his work plus a lot of other work and built on it. But what we did, sorry, I digress, but we took that white paper that had now been refined and we sent it around in a Delphi study to some of the best folks in this field from around the world. And we made sure it was a diverse group of people, geographically, gender, age, ethnic background. So we're getting a wide variety of opinions about what this thing might need to look like in the future. The Delphi study is an interesting technique to use in those kind of problems where you don't really have any really firm, solid research that you can pull upon, but you're not quite at that place having to rely entirely on expert opinion. But it involves having a white paper or some document that could go out there for review. All these Delphi participants looking at that, refining it, sending it back. We make notes of everything that they've come up with and said, here's kind of an amalgamated view of what everybody thought about this document. Let's send it back to you and see what you think about that. So you get to see everybody else's opinion without knowing who it was actually that was chiming in on this thing. Key point. So we ran that through a few cycles and got a document that we were reasonably happy with. And then we spent 2 years going around the world and presenting it and having listening sessions from others that were in the field, students, researchers, academics, practitioners, just getting their feedback. So we, in the end, were able to refine the document and have something we're reasonably confident represented what we needed to be doing in the field moving into the future.
It's such a difficult thing because emergency managers do such a broad range of functions. Depending whether they're in the public, private, or NGO sector, but also in any of those, it could be anything from, like a specialist in risk analysis to somebody who's just doing preparedness plans. It's just, so I imagine like developing a set of core competencies would be very difficult from that point of view, but also like sometimes I wonder, disasters, they affect, the larger events, every sector of society.
Yeah.
And I wonder, and maybe this is a bit of a tangent too, but do you think emergency management is more effective as a centralized function or as a distributed function within organizations?
Yes.
Okay.
Both.
Oh.
Both. As a centralized function, providing a framework, providing policy, providing the kind of guidance, the things that sort of unite us. But with that in mind, in a decentralized way, can everybody be singing from the same sheet of music, but singing in the place where they're at and making it work in their own particular way? And whether it's in Toronto or across Canada, I think the same thing holds true. Or even just within an organization, can emergency management, at the highest level, provide that guidance, the framework, the policy, the support, the continuing education, and everything else makes it work. But to pick up on what you said earlier, can we all understand this is all of our responsibilities and do what we need to do to make this thing work better? So for example, in Toronto, maybe the school system is able to work in accordance with what is trying to be achieved across Toronto, and maybe teachers are able to bring that into their lessons, what's going on. But at the same time, the water supply people and the sanitation people all understand how they fit into the picture. And the accountants and the lawyers and everybody else understands how they fit in the picture. And with that in place, we develop a much more cohesive system that is able to respond. It may be a very small town. A lot of our family is from Russell, Manitoba, actually a little town north of there called Inglis. So do they in Russell understand how they could be affected by flooding or severe winter storms or pandemic? But can everybody all the way through the community understand that too and work to the same framework? So decentralized and centralized at the same time.
Yeah, I think, well, just thinking about, where I live, we have a long way to go. The vast majority of emergency managers in Ontario, for example, are fire chiefs or other civic employees who do it off the sides of the desk in addition to their main job without a whole lot of training in it.
Yeah.
So, the aspirational kind of goal that you're talking about, I think there's quite a distance to travel.
Yeah.
Before we can get there. What do we have to put in place in a practical way, do you think, to get closer to that goal?
Yeah. It's an interesting question, that one. And let me back up a little bit and talk about kind of the early days in emergency management in the 80s and 90s around California. And we were actually much better at emergency management back then than we are now. And a lot of the reason for that is that we were starting to understand the compelling need to have these systems in place, because of wildfire, because of earthquake problems, all these other things. There wasn't a lot of guidance at that point, and there were some things that were coming out of FEMA that would help us understand how to do this better. But mostly it was a function that became sort of an organic part of the organization. In other words, what in the case of a city, the city manager would probably appoint somebody within the organization to just take this on as part of their responsibility. And often it was in California, many of the people that became emergency managers had been secretaries or some type of assistants, and showed a lot of promise for it, and took on the task. And many women were doing the work in Southern California. And there was a more of a collaborative nature than some of the guys would necessarily approach this. And they didn't necessarily within the cities have a lot of money. So they had to collaboratively work between the different parts of the city to come up with something that would make sense, given the very compelling need to have these systems in place. And we became much better at sharing across cities. We used to have planning sessions, joint planning sessions, where we would have developed a nuclear blast plan or a earthquake plan or a wildfire plan, and we would share them across all the different neighboring cities. And there wasn't any proprietary work or anything like that. It was just assumed that we would share all these things, and they would get much better each time they were shared too. We would add a little bit, refine a little bit. So it was a much different kind of system. What happened then, we had 9/11 in the United States, and just a kind of a reorientation of what emergency management was. There was an immense amount of federal money that was dumped into these systems, and a lot of consulting companies popping up and offering to come in and do all the plans development. The emergency managers became grant managers. The planners were 25-year-old MBAs that were coming out and working for some big consulting firm, and it became commonplace to have a $200,000 plan built by somebody from the outside. They had no idea really how relevant that plan would be, or how much ownership there would be amongst all the people that would depend on that plan, and get stuck in the corner. And it was proprietary, so it couldn't be shared, and it took us back a long ways from what we had more naturally evolved to in the 90s. So in the United States, at least, we're really suffering from that now. We have the advantage of a lot of emergency management, higher education, they could help us understand this better, but in some ways we're rebuilding our capacity. And a lot of people don't understand we actually were better at it before. We saw it at the federal level too, in the 90s under the guidance of James Lee Witt at FEMA. There was huge emphasis on mitigation. There was a much more of a collegial attitude towards the work. The supportive work of the federal agencies was approached with humility, like we had talked about a little bit earlier. They weren't so interested in taking credit. They were happy to sit in the background and help prop up the local agencies. So what we have to evolve to in the future is, we're not going back to the 90s. I hope we don't go back to the post 9/11 grant manager days for emergency management, but it's building a much more sophisticated capability in emergency managers. And we've got that going in the universities now. The people that come out of our programs are phenomenal, and they're ready to do the work. But the transition that needs to happen now is not just working on the supply side, providing these emergency managers, but working on the demand side. And by that, I mean, at all levels in the organization, whether it's at the provincial level or at the city level, within corporations, national levels, is there a demand? Is there an expectation? I want the highest quality emergency manager, somebody that's really going to be able to guide us through these likely events in the future. We have to be able to show that we can do that. And it doesn't necessarily mean a 30-year fire chief that now all of a sudden is calling himself an emergency manager without understanding the intricacies of this, but somebody that's very well equipped and has the guts, and the fortitude and the integrity to be able to do this work at a very sophisticated level.
Homer Dixon talks about the ingenuity gap, how our problems are growing at a pace that's faster than our ability to design solutions to them.
Yeah.
Are you of that view, or are you more optimistic?
I'm way more optimistic, but the solutions aren't necessarily where we think they are. Forgive me on the details of this, but we'll soon have 9 billion people on the planet within a couple of decades. And how many geniuses will there be amongst those 9 billion people? How many Einsteins, how many Edisons, how many absolutely phenomenal human beings will exist on the planet at the same time? But they may be in a slum in Calcutta, or in the countryside in Kenya, or in your program in Toronto. The question is, can we provide the opportunity? Can we recognize when these people emerge? And can we bring them in to help us find our way at the highest levels in solving these problems so we can live on the planet? But also, there's so many people at that next level that are ingenious and creating new things and new approaches all the time. Can we draw them into this also and help enable them to be able to come up with some of these solutions? We're doing a lot of that right now in dealing with the fire problem, particularly up in the Malibu communities here in Southern California. Now, this is not a normal community. There a lot of people that have done incredibly well in life live there, but they're smart, they're clever, they love their community, they want to engage, they want to find new ways of doing things, they're bold, they're coming up with ways of dealing with the fire problem that we haven't even thought of in the past. So we're not just leaving it to the fire chief to come up with it, but we're saying, let's all get our heads together and think this one through and see what we might be able to come up with. So yeah, I'm hopeful, but that again is part of the emergency manager's task. Can we see that as a kind of a grand problem solving as part of the work that we have to do, and to be able to make something practical out of that?
That would be a really interesting discussion for another time. I would say I'm less optimistic than you are, because the forces that are driving risk creation are so powerful and so embedded in our social, technological, political, economic systems that it's hard for me to see how the future isn't bleak at this time.
Yeah.
But I guess that's a discussion for another time. That could go on for quite a while.
Yeah, and I guess I would probably leave you with this. There's going to be a whole lot of tension in that. I'm no by means Pollyannish about that being an easy road. In fact, that probably being a very tense road. But when we find it's in our mutual interest to deal much more decisively and constructively with the risk we're creating, and when we have to shine a bright light on it and understand the roots of it, it creates a very compelling situation to deal with it. And I think when people start to understand they can actually make money on it, as well, to be so crass. That drives a lot of innovation too.
Are there any last, I know our time's just about up. Is there any last comment you would like to make to wrap this up?
I guess for people that have been in the field for a while, they may understand this. For people that are new and contemplating getting into this field, it's extraordinarily rewarding, but it's very difficult. It will take its toll on you doing this. You're dealing with some of the most difficult problems that humanity faces. Whether you're on the front end of it, on a fire line, or, in some kind of disaster response, or if you're a step or two back, you're still going to feel it. It's going to take its toll. You have a community here that's incredible and very supportive, and we need to lean on each other as we work our way through these things. And don't forget that, it's the work is hard, but there's beautiful people doing this work. And if we can help each other, I think we can find a way through. But don't underestimate the toll it's going to take. And I say that after 42 years. I got plenty of ghosts spinning around in my head, but it's also been a wonderful time.
Well, Steve, I want to thank you again very much for generously giving your time. And I'm sure all the students who watch this will be inspired by your words. Thank you again.
Okay, well, they'll either be inspired or say that guy's nuts. All right, thank you very much for the opportunity, and all the best to you and your work up there.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.